Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Grand Rounds. My name is Tom Fardon. I'm a chair and organizer of Grand Rounds. And after a very brief hiatus for an Easter holiday, I hope you all had a nice time. If you had managed to get some time off, I was up in the Highlands. It was beautiful. When the weather's great up there, I think there's no better place to be, and we were particularly lucky this time. But we're back now, and we're straight back into the I suppose, summer program. And Ian Hewitt from the digital pharmacy team contacted me at the beginning of the year to ask for this slot so that we could give the introduction to HEPMA, the electronic prescribing program, which has already started to roll out across NHS Tayside, but is going to be accelerating through the months of May and June. So this is obviously a big change, I think a welcome change as we move to electronic prescribing, the increased governance that is associated with that and reduction of risk. But any change is a change, and I think when we moved across to electronic notes, I think we all experienced that frustration of laptops not charged up and where's the connections and where does things work. So there's certainly some teething problems to work out, but I do know that there are areas across the patch who have already started using HEPMA. They've already got some feedback through this. The system is improving, and hopefully some people in the audience will be able to give us some of their feedback about how they're finding it. So Ian, I've heard a version of this talk already at our own local teaching. I'm looking forward to this again today. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We can get to them at the end. If you've got any comments about your experience with this version or other electronic prescribing systems, then please put them in. And I'm sure that if you've got constructive comments, criticisms, suggestions, please put them in there. I'm sure they'll be welcome to the team to be able to work on those things. Ian, thank you very much for joining us. And you have the floor, virtually at least.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go through a few slides just to give a bit of sort of background to kind of where we're at, some of the positives about it, some of the potential challenges, and then I'm going to go to do a demo of the system, and then, as Tom said, we can discuss any questions. I think Tom alluded to it, and Peter Curry kind of talked to this a bit, the kind of introduction he gave at the all hospital call a few weeks ago, that inevitably as we roll this out, there are going to be some challenges, and kind of Peter described it as we might make things a wee bit worse to start with, but once we get this in, it then puts us in a place to hopefully make things much better and much safer in the medium to long term when it comes to prescribing and administration of medicines. So to give a wee bit of background, so in Tayside we are implementing a system called CMM, used to be called JAC, and it is in use in most other boards in Scotland already. So Ayrshire and Arran, Forth Valley, Lanarkshire have used it for, varying between kind of 5 and 15 years, depending on the site. Glasgow and Lothian have just been rolling out over the last few years. And we're implementing it as part of a regional programme, along with Grampian, Highland, Shetland, Orkney and the Western Isles. So initially, things took a while to get going. We had to change pharmacy systems first from a local Prescribe system to a regional system made by the supplier CMM, and that piece of work took a lot longer than we anticipated. And so, some people might have heard us talking about HEPMA for several years, but now we've finally got through that kind of early phase and we are starting to roll out. So just to move on to the next slide, I'll show you our kind of rollout plan. So paediatrics went live on the 21st of February. The neonatal unit went live the following week, and then the week after that, young people's unit went live. So those were our kind of early adopter sites. We've had a period of about 5 weeks for it to bed in there until I was to prepare for rolling out in PRI, and that's due to start next week. So we're going to take 4 weeks to roll out PRI before then taking a 2-week kind of pause. And then looking to do medicine at 9 Wells, again over a 4-week period, starting from the 29th of May. And then from the 10th of July to the kind of end of August, we'll be looking to do specialist services, oncology, haematology, surgery, orthopedics, and theatres. After that, we'll then be looking to look at the community hospitals. before then looking at other sites like mental health. And the aim is that we will have HEPMA rolled out across the relevant sites in Tayside by mid-November. Emergency department is in there as a kind of question mark at the end. So at the moment, most other boards in Scotland don't have HEPMA in the emergency department. So we've had some local discussions here, and it's basically been left as, let's kind of wait till we get a bit further through the rollout. They can actually see the system in action in other wards, and then we'll make a decision about whether they would be included or not. So to give a bit of background about some of the potential benefits. So I think the way the system supports medicines administration, although there's some flaws with it, overall is better than paper. So it kind of, it'll prevent you moving on, or at least make it more difficult to move on to today's days of medicines administrations, unless you've documented something for all the medicines that were due to be given yesterday. So something that is consistently shown in data from other boards is our reduction in the number of missed doses. On a similar theme, when it comes to doing some work around time critical medicines and making sure that patients are getting their medicines on time, that's again areas where often there's been improvements in other boards. Decision support for prescribing. So I'll show you that as we're demoing the system, but we've got some decision support around allergies, around drug interactions, and around therapeutic duplicates. At the moment, this aspect of the system is fairly limited, but hopefully over time, that's something that will get better and could become really big. An obvious one is legible. The TPAR, depending on who's written it, isn't always necessarily clear to see, whereas on HEPMA, any prescription on HEPMA is going to be legible. Clear communication, again, linked to that legibility. And finally, and again, something that will build up over time when you look at other boards, the data that they've suddenly been able to get from HEPMA has been allowed them to do lots of things, both in terms of kind of audit, QI and research, but also in terms of being able to use that data to direct the way day-to-day patient care is delivered as well. So we've got some early access to the data at the moment, but that's something that's likely to build up over time, particularly once we get the system rolled out. That'll become a big focus next, is how can we really get the best out of this data. Okay, so the next couple of slides I've talked about positives there, but as we'd said, there's some limitations and challenges that I think it's good to make people aware of from an early stage. So it definitely isn't going to replace your own clinical judgment. I would say that's a good thing, but sometimes it is easy for prescribers to get in the habit of thinking that the system's going to do everything for them, and therefore they might miss something because they're not thinking about things to the same extent that they should be. Interfaces to start with are going to be limited. So there is an interface with track care, so that you don't, basically to support patient movements into the hospital and between wards. Interfaces for discharge and MedRec are not up and running yet. So for discharge, the initial plan was to interface HEPMA with portal discharge form, but due to a kind of combination of digital resourcing issues and also the upgrade to Clinical Portal 3, the work on that's been delayed with a current estimated timescale of spring 2024. Because of that delay, we're currently scoping out an alternative option where HEPMA could potentially be used for the immediate discharge letter, with track care being used for the final discharge letter. And the digital team think that one potentially could be delivered a lot quicker. So there's work going on at the moment looking at both the practical and kind of technical aspects of that, and Dougie Elder would be looking to put an SBAR around the various relevant groups if that proposal got to a stage where we thought that was the way to go. So you should hear something about that fairly soon if that option progresses. The current version of the system can't import medicines from primary care to support MedRec, but the next version that we're likely to be upgrading to next year can. So we won't have that option at the moment, but I would estimate within the next 1 to 2 years, we would hopefully have ability to support MedRec through imported medicines on admission. Finally, there are some kind of more complex drugs where the system doesn't quite have the functionality to kind of fully prescribe and administer them on the system. Common examples, insulin, warfarin, and continuous infusion. So generally for those, the process will be that there'll be a placeholder on HEPMA that'll say, for example, aminophylline as per paper chart, and then the details of the prescription will be documented on the paper continuous infusion chart. Similar to MedRec, this is one where we're needing the system to be developed a bit more to allow us to have these drugs fully prescribed. So at the moment, they're going to be via this kind of placeholder paper process, but hopefully in the future, we would look to get these on HEPMA once we're on a kind of future version of the system. So a few things really just to flag around things we expect to be a bit of a challenge as we roll out. So the probably biggest bit of feedback around problems that are caused during rollout is that when patients move between HEPMA and non-HEPMA wards or non-HEPMA and HEPMA, it tends to cause problems. So that was one of the reasons why paediatrics and the associated sites were chosen as early adopters, as they don't have an awful lot of movement into other wards. So if a patient moves from a HEPMA to a non-HEPMA ward, there's a chart called a MAC and MAP chart that can be printed off, which is essentially like a printed version of the HEPMA chart. And that would go with the patient. If a patient moves from a non-HEPMA ward to a HEPMA ward, then the prescriptions would need to be transcribed from paper onto HEPMA. The kind of biggest bit of feedback you get from other boards about the best way to mitigate this is essentially to try and roll out as quickly as you can so that you get through that period as early as possible. And I think within the resource constraints that we've got, that is what we are aiming to do in trying to get HEPMA rolled out this year. Prescribing by product. So at the moment on the TPAR for most drugs, you would just you would write a drug and you would write a dose. The way it works on HEPMA is that you would be selecting a specific formulation. And that's something that it will take prescribers a wee bit of getting used to. What's a positive about the way this is set up relative to the discharge system is that it's linked to what we stock in pharmacy. So the kind of list that you need to pick from will be smaller, and also it is linked to the things that we are not guaranteed that we've got them in stock, but the things that we would routinely keep a stock of. Protocols is a benefit that I'll come on to in the demo, but sometimes there can be a bit of a kind of nuance in terms of the prescriber knowing, should I be prescribing this drug or group of drugs using a protocol or just using the individual drugs themselves. There will be some drugs where there's a default dose and or frequency that's defaulted in the system. In general, this will be done where there is one standard dose that's used for the vast majority of patients. But that does mean that prescribers need to be careful that they are, as part of that process, checking that that dose is appropriate for that individual patient and indication. Within the system, there's the ability to modify prescriptions, but when you do that for either a dose or a frequency, it tends to cause some problems on the administration side. So we would actually be recommending in those situations to discontinue the drug and re-prescribe it as you would do on the TPAR at the moment. I'd mentioned decision support for interactions earlier on. So so basically within the system, we have 4 different levels we can set them at. So we can have interactions for alerts for every drug interaction. We can have them for the top category only by severity, or we can have it for the top 2 or 3 categories. So based on feedback from other boards that the number of alerts goes up exponentially as you go through those categories, and in line with practice in other boards, we're only going to have alerts for this kind of category 1, the most significant category of drug interactions. What that does mean, though, is from a prescriber's point of view, is that you do still need to consider that there are going to be some drug interactions that the system's not going to alert you about. Syringe pumps and infusions I've covered. Gentamicin is one of the drugs that is going to remain on a paper chart, although it would be possible to have it fully on HEPMA. Some boards have done it fully on HEPMA, but for initially, we felt stick with the gent chart. Vancomycin will be done fully on HEPMA in line with current practice to do it on the TPAR. VTE prescribing, so at the moment there's a prompt on the TPAR to prescribe dalteparin. It's not possible to have that same type of prompt within HEPMA, although there is a VTE assessment module that could be used. The VTE group previously had a bit of discussion about this and felt going in that direction wasn't the way to go. This is something we're going to be keeping a close eye on as we roll out in PRI, is just ensuring that there isn't any impact on compliance with VTE prescribing as a result of losing that prompt. Finally, I'd mentioned that there's an interface with track so that the system knows where the patient is, and the reason for having that is to prevent the double work of admitting, transferring and discharging a patient both in track and HEPMA. But there is inconsistency in the extent to which track is kept up to date and used in line with SOPs, and we know from our early experience here and also feedback from other boards that it does cause problems in HEPMA where that's the case. So for example, if a patient hasn't been discharged on track, they're going to appear on the nurse's administration list, and that can interfere with their workflows there. Okay, so this was really just a couple of slides again to come back to this data. This is some early data that the regional data analyst team have pulled from one from the UAT system and another from the live system. Not necessarily a specific report that we have in mind to use, but just an example of the type of things that we can get out of the system. And essentially, the summary is that anything that's recorded on HEPMA should be reportable. So there's lots that we can hopefully develop with this over time. This was just to flag, if you want to find out a bit more information, we've got a HEPMA website on StaffNet. So if you click on clinical systems and then further information beside HEPMA, that'll take you to this. And we've got various information around prescribing, drug administration, pharmacy processes, training, FAQs, that type of thing. So if people want to find out more themselves, this is an area to go. And finally, in terms of the slides, just to share the information about the e-learning. So as we move closer to roll out in your area, a member of the HEPMA team will be in touch with a kind of lead medic, the senior charge nurse and relevant pharmacy people around training opportunities. The core mandatory training will be the e-learning module for prescribing or administration as applicable to your role. But in addition to that, we would be offering optional kind of drop-in sessions, Teams demos, and also the option for people to access a training version of the system themselves so they can kind of have a bit of a practice. There's information around how to do that on the training section on the HEPMA website. So actually anyone who wants to, even from now, can go on and start to have a bit of a play about with how things work in that. Okay, so that's the end of my slides. I'm just going to go on now to go into the system and show you a couple of things in there.
Ian, can I just perhaps interject with a question? I think that's Ola in the audience, is it? Saying what provision is being put in place for operating theatres? Do I still need to write out a paper TPAR for post-op analgesia, fragment antibiotics, etc.?
No, so the plan would be that for theatres, they basically for things that would currently go on the TPAR, so largely antibiotics, analgesia, things like that, they would go on to HEPMA. And we've actually just been in some discussions earlier this week around what kit theatres at PRI are going to use. So essentially they've got some small laptops that they're going to be using to put the drugs onto HEPMA.
Thanks very much. Another question whilst that's loading. I think Claire Douglas. I wonder, so I work between Cornhill Macmillan Centre and PRI, and patients are transferred between both. So when HEPMA comes to PRI next week, is it coming to Cornhill as well?
Yes, it will be. So Cornhill is in week 4. So that would be the week commencing, I think it's the 8th of May. So there will be that period of 3 weeks where there's other wards in PRI that are live and Cornhill isn't. But yes, by the end of the rollout, Cornhill will be on HEPMA.
Okay, so there's going to be 3 weeks of slight frustration but it should be small numbers of people, hopefully, Claire.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so I will just give a bit of an overview of how kind of prescribing and administration in the system works. So if nothing had been recorded for allergy status for this patient, before it'll let me prescribe, it's going to force me to record something. And you would do that by clicking on this task here. So what's happened for this patient is, someone's been using them before, is allergy status has been set to undetermined. So essentially this is the thing in the system that will allow you to, if you say you've got urgent something you need to give, and you can't confirm the patient's allergy status, there is the option to set it as undetermined to allow you to prescribe something. But what will happen if you do that is a pop-up will keep appearing up in this communication zone section here when people log in future as a reminder to properly record allergy status. This inpatient RX screen, this is likely to be the screen that prescribers are going to use most commonly. And this is where you would do any prescribing from, and also where you're likely to use where you're wanting to kind of review a patient's drug chart to consider the medicines they're on. So if I want to add a drug, I'll click on this here. And there's a couple of different ways of adding drugs. I'll show you the sort of normal way of adding a drug first, but then I'll come on to protocols once I've done a couple of normal prescriptions. So if I wanted to prescribe aspirin, I would type in the first however many letters, and that'll come up with a list of formulations that meets my kind of search criteria. In general, one of the things that's come up in pediatrics is people searching under brand names and thinking that they can't find the drug. In general, most things will be listed under the generic name, but where the brand name is clinically significant, that'll be listed in brackets afterwards. So in general search for generic name, there is a kind of workaround you can do where if you know the brand but you don't know the generic name, you can try searching using a question mark and then putting in the brand, and that'll then find anything where that's listed in brackets afterwards. Okay, so if I want to select aspirin 75, there's a few, so if there's nothing set up in the background around some of these first bits, this is the screen you would get taken to first, but I'll show you the screens that may come up for some medicines. So first of all, there's drug notes. So in the back end of the system, we can attach notes to individual drugs if there's anything in particular that we want to flag either to the prescriber or to the nurse or to both. Now we want to be careful with these not to use too many of them, because similar with the interactions bit we discussed earlier, if you have too many drug notes, then people just get in the habit of ignoring them all. So up until now, we've only really set them up for gentamicin and vancomycin. But as we go forward and as clinicians start to request things that they think would be useful to support safe prescribing or administration, then we can look to get more of these added in. Again, but with that caveat of being careful, we don't kind of let them escalate too much. If a drug was flagged as non-formulary, then a kind of alert would come up here, just flagging that they're trying to prescribe a non-formulary drug and suggesting alternative formulary drugs they could consider. And drug conflicts is where the sort of decision support alerts would come up. So if you try to prescribe a drug or a group of drugs that the patient's documented as being allergic to, then that will come up as a conflict here. Similar if there's a significant drug interaction flagged. And finally, if you're trying to prescribe the same drug twice, so maybe you're trying to prescribe paracetamol and cocodamol, it'll come up with a warning here. So what I'll do here is I'll basically give you the option of either not continuing with your prescription, or alternatively, you can give a reason why you want to continue. One of the things we're actually hoping to do with the data soon, and Glasgow did this, was to try and pull a wee bit of data on how many of these drug conflicts are being created and how many are actually being accepted by the prescriber, to kind of give a bit of an idea of how beneficial these decision support alerts are. Okay, so assuming we've been through all of those, and for probably the vast majority of prescriptions, it's just going to take you straight to this order entry screen. So first of all, need to consider what type of prescription we want to give. So whether it's a regular, a PRN, a stat, or you can also do, for example, a regular with an associated stat. This is going to default probably to regular for most medicines, but for things where they would most commonly be given PRN, they'll default to PRN, but the prescriber can always change it either way, depending on what they clinically needs to be. From, again, some of the early testing in peds, forgetting to change regular to PRN or vice versa is actually one of the kind of, I suppose, common pitfalls that prescribers struggle to get used to. So I'd mentioned earlier about default doses. So for some medicines, I think we've got about 300 where these are set up. There will be a default dose and frequency set up in the system. So for aspirin, 75, there is a default dose and frequency of once a day, or 75 once a day at 8 AM. This can be changed by the prescriber at the point of prescribing, just by changing the number there, or for the frequency, amending to a different time here. And if that was blank, you would obviously just enter the dose and select an appropriate frequency from there. For a lot of medicines, the route of administration, so we kind of set these up in the background. So if there's only one route for the medicine that would be kind of clinically appropriate, that'll be set up. But where there's multiple routes that the medicine could be given by, so for example, if it could be a IM or IV, at the screen after you select the drug, it'll ask the prescriber to select what route they want. The start date and time will default to now, but if I wanted it, for example, to start on Saturday, I could change the date to that, or I could change the time if I wanted to change the date. I can also select a number of days or doses of treatment for things like antibiotics, steroids, anything else where you've got a set course that you kind of know at the point of prescribing. And there's an alternative way of doing this of picking a stop date. So once I've completed all of that, I'll then get taken on to a kind of confirmation screen, where I will see the prescription the way that nursing staff would see it at the point of administration, to allow me to do a sort of final check of my prescription before confirming. So I can either click confirm here, or I can click confirm and prescribe another if I'm wanting to prescribe other medicines. So I'm going to do a couple more. So I'll do a PRN just to make sure I've got something available to administer. So looking to prescribe paracetamol. So that'll default again. So this is going to default to a gram every 4 hours. The one slight difference with PRN medicines is there's these 2 boxes here for PRN notes, which is kind of equivalent to the boxes we've got on the TPAR at the moment. So again, for some medicines, we'll have pre-built stuff in the back end of the system. So where there's a fairly standard either indication and or maximum, then this will be pre-built in the back of the system. But where there's not, or where it's a less commonly used medicine, these will be blank, and it'll force the prescriber to enter something for this. So again, I would then go to this final screen to kind of review my prescription and then confirm it. So the next thing I wanted to show is a protocol. So we don't have many of these set up at the moment. So currently, with this being a regional system, we are needing to wait on regional governance being signed off around exactly what is the process for somebody requesting a protocol, and then thereafter, what's the process that we go through to get it kind of built and checked. Hopefully that will happen within the next month or so, and at that point we would then look to try and kind of develop these. The feedback from other boards is that from a prescriber point of view, it's probably the best bit about the system, because it can make the prescribing process quicker, but also where you're wanting to encourage compliance with a guideline, it's a good way to do that as well. So I'll show you a couple of examples of these. So the first one is a prednisolone reducing protocol. So this has been set up as you start at 40 milligrams and you reduce by 5 milligram per week. So what this will do is it will basically create a line for, so if you didn't have this protocol, each one of these lines would need to be prescribed individually. But with the protocol, it can be done in a 1 hour. So essentially what the prescriber would need to do is just have a look at these lines to just confirm that they're clinically appropriate for the patient. And if they are, they could go again to that confirmation screen and confirm the prescription. Another one, and one of the few that actually is set up at the moment, is we've got one for palliative just in case medicines. So because the options could be either oxycodone or morphine for your opiate, what it's going to first of all do is ask you to select which you would want for your opiate. And once I've done that, it'll take me to that same screen as before. So for the midazolam, the hyoscine, and the levomethomazine, because they have kind of fairly standard doses that would usually be given, that information is all defaulted. But for the morphine, because the starting dose could vary, that's been left blank, and the prescriber will input what the appropriate dose is for that patient. And then again, I would get taken to that kind of final confirmation screen before completing my prescription. Okay, so that is an overview of prescribing. What I'll now do is I'll go over to show you administration. So within the system, there's a screen called administration round. And essentially, this is the screen that nurses are likely to use most commonly in the system. And what it'll do is for a ward, that will give an overview of every patient in the ward. And along here on the left-hand side, there is going to be a black tick if there's no regular medicines that are due at the moment, although there might be PRNs that could potentially be given. There's going to be an amber arrow if there's a medicine that is available for administration. And there's going to be a red arrow if there is something that is overdue from more than a day ago. This is a screen where, again, feedback from other boards is that it really helps the nursing workflow, because at the moment, when the nurses are doing their admin round, they have to go around every TPAR to know which patients are actually due medicines at 8 o'clock, for example. Whereas with this screen, if they go in at 8 o'clock, by looking for the patients that have got amber arrows, they can quite quickly see who's actually due medicines. So a common benefit that's shown in other boards is a reduction in the amount of time taken to carry out an administration round. Paediatrics, neonates don't really do administration rounds in the same way as they tend to do in adult wards, so that's not an area we've really been able to look at so far, but hopefully as we roll out to other sites, we can start to kind of keep an eye on how that's going. The other thing is that, so if it gets to midnight tonight, what should happen is it should move over to basically this version of the screen for tomorrow. But if there's patients who have not been given a medicine for today, what it'll do is it's going to keep defaulting back to today, although that can be overridden. And because of that, it really encourages forces the kind of ward teams to make sure that everything from today has been administered before they move on. And I think that's why in other boards you often find a really big reduction in missed doses. So for example, I think in Glasgow, I think it went down from like 20% of patients have had a missed dose to something like 6 with HEPMA. What I'll do is, so the patient that I've just been prescribing for there, I'd prescribed their aspirin for I think midday tomorrow, so that isn't showing up as being due. But the PRN medicines I was prescribing are now available for administration. So first of all, it's going to take the nurse to this screen here. So this essentially gives a bit of an overview of all the medicines that the patient's prescribed, and that's just so that they're administering the medicine in context of all the patient's medicines rather than just considering the ones that are due at the moment. When they then go into the administration screen, so this screen, regular medicines, will show any regular medicines that are available for administration at the moment. And that's going to show up an hour before the time it's prescribed for, and it'll stay there after for as long as you want until it's been given. Here it's going to show any PRN medicines. So medicines can be administered individually from these two screens here. But actually what they're likely to do a lot in practice when patients are due more than one medicine at a time is use Quick Chart. So within Quick Chart, what they can do is they can tick multiple medicines and at once document that they've given them all. I can't remember a username and password to document a witness, so I'll just untick those controlled drugs and then click Chart to say that I've given the dose. So that, I suppose, is a bit of a kind of overview of prescribing administration. Happy to take any questions just now or any other things that people would like to see in the system.
Ian, there are a couple of questions in the chat. I'll just run through them. So Kay Walker says, would clinical research staff have access, as may be required in cases where research participants are admitted? This will be for purposes of serious adverse event reporting.
Yeah, it's definitely possible for them to. So there's, I suppose, we have different levels of access. There's standard access for medical staff, for nurses, for pharmacy staff, and there's also read-only access for staff where they feel that they wouldn't need access to kind of actually document prescribing or administration of the system. One thing we would need to do is just make sure that we're picking up on getting your team access to the system at the right point in time and rollout. But if someone gets in touch with myself or the team, we can look to arrange that alternatively. We've already got a form in the IT help desk for staff to get access. So if you had a small group of staff looking to get access, they could actually fill that in any time from now.
Next is Alex Downey, I think, by the content. Tayside are pioneering pharmacogenomics with the P4ME initiative. HEPMA is part of the pharmacogenomics initiative in Glasgow with decision support. Can we incorporate pharmacogenomic decision support locally in HEPMA? So this is the genetics that determine whether you'll be super sensitive to clopidogrel, for example, and also some azoles.
Yeah, so there should be things we would be able to do with the drug notes around that. I think it doesn't at the moment. There isn't anything smart enough in the system for it to know what genetics the patients have got to flag it for that particular patient, but there's certainly things we could do with the drug notes for the relevant drugs to flag that this is considered as part of the prescribing process. So yeah, again, if you wanted to get in touch, more than happy to have a discussion about how we could take that forward.
Alex is leading on that, I think, across the patch, so maybe leave it to him to get in touch and see if that's what the best way to do that is. Tom McDonald, presumably the system will prescribe and record hospital-only prescribed medicines, such as monoclonal antibodies, to outpatients. Will it let GPs know these have been prescribed?
So at the moment, the focus is going to be on the inpatient part of the rollout, and that's really what we're looking at this year. One of the kind of next developments, once we get it rolled out to inpatients, will be to look at how it's going to work for outpatients, and probably that communication part to primary care would be a key part of that. So at the moment, no definite decisions made, but we would definitely want to consider communication as part of that outpatient rollout.
Super. Okay, no other questions in the chat at the moment. I'm just looking out for any hands that might be springing up from any of the audience. Anybody in the audience from the paediatric team or the neonatal team, anyone who's used the system, any feedback, any comments? Another question, Mustafa's iPhone asks, is it possible to hold an already prescribed medicine for a couple of days and set a review date?
Yes, so I think so. Hold on a second, and I'll actually just try and do it just now. So order, modify, and then you can do suspend. And then give a reason. So you can't do it as part of that suspension process, but what you can do is you can attach something called a task. So you could suspend it, and then you could attach what's called a task, which would basically say review need to restart, and then you could pick when that task would due. And that would pop up at that same screen where the allergies were.
Okay. Right. Lovely. Did you mention oxygen prescribing? I'm sorry if I missed that.
You know what, I didn't know. So the plan for oxygen prescribing is that'll be a protocol. So there's basically 4 protocols set up, each of which will include a regular and an as required prescription. So there's 2 that have kind of specific SATs set in the system, and then there's another 2 where it's for patient specific SATs, and that they would be documented in the PRN notes or a normal note, depending on whether it's the as required or the regular prescription.
Excellent. That's obviously the first thing on all our TPAs at the moment is oxygen, which I'm proud to say we managed to get that sorted a few years ago. So I'm glad it's not been forgotten. Well, if there's no more questions, comments, then we'll call things to a conclusion. Thanks so much, Ian, for going through all that. And this will go onto YouTube, and as all our grand rounds do, and hopefully be a resource that people can drop back into to get ready for when it rolls out to their areas. And I know that you've been doing this as a sort of rolling roadshow in different areas already, and you're always around for any questions. I suspect there'll be teething problems and a period of adjustment, and there'll be a lot of people perhaps being a little bit grumpy about the complexity and how new it is and how much longer it takes to do something new, but that's always the way. And I think most of us, I'm sure, strongly support this in terms of the governance, the reporting, the ease of use, particularly for our nursing colleagues, as you described earlier. So thanks so much, Ian, for coming along. Thanks to everyone for joining in. There is currently no one down for Grand Rounds next week, but I have actually just had an email from someone who's offered to fill the slot. So I'm just going to investigate that, and I'll email you at the beginning of next week with the possibility of who's coming next to Grand Rounds. Thanks everyone else for joining. Enjoy the rest of your day. Have a good weekend, and take care.